No law or ordinance is higher than understanding. Politics, possibly now more important than ever before in my lifetime. I am delighted to welcome Oxford East MP Shadow Chancellor Anneliese Dodds, together with Rob Watson, BBC World Service Political Correspondent, to discuss matters such as COVID-19, the EU, the future of the arts, the future of education, the future of the creative industries, and what might a new future look like under a Labour government. Please join us in the discussion and send your questions to our comments box, which will be monitored throughout the evening. Thank you.
Just what everyone needs, of course, on a Friday night is a journalist talking to a politician to really cheer you up. But we are undaunted and very grateful to have you with us. Now, I hope you're not going to mind what's coming next, Anneliese, but I saw a great headline about you this week from a columnist who I really respect, Rachel Sylvester. It was on top of an article in Prospect magazine, and it claimed, and I quote, Anneliese Dodds is now one of the most important people in British politics. Here's why, end quotation. Hopefully we'll get at some of the why in this session for the Oxford Arts Festival. But first, a quick glimpse at Anneliese's journey so far. Born in Aberdeen, has degrees from Oxford, Edinburgh and LSE. And after working as a lecturer in public policy, she became a member of the European Parliament in 2014. Before, as mentioned earlier, being elected to the UK Parliament in 2017, and now, of course, is Shadow Chancellor. For those not familiar with British politics, it's the chief finance economic spokesman for the main opposition Labour Party. And she's achieved all of this, as far as I can make out, without attracting the usual jealousies and enmity from colleagues in her own party. And here's another quotation from the columnist I mentioned earlier. One Labour frontbencher says, everyone likes her. She has never caused me any reason to be offended or even mildly irritated. That's her key strength. It's very hard to be angry with her, even when her Treasury team is saying, don't commit to spending any money. She's also the mother of 2 young children, so she's got plenty of spare time. Right. Can I start, Anneliese, with a couple of personal questions? I'll bring in some questions from other people as we go along, but a couple of personal-ish ones and direct ones from me first. The first one is, given the bitterness of British politics since 2016 and the incredibly low esteem politicians are held in, what on earth made you leave academia?
Well, thanks very much for that question. I'll try and answer it in a moment. But I guess just before I plunge in, can I just say a massive thanks to everyone involved with the festival. I think it's amazing that it's still continuing. And, you know, even with those slight technical issues, I have to say I've heard much worse language due to these than what was issuing from your lips, Rob. No, it's really, really good to be here, and well done to everyone involved with this. I mean, actually, people sometimes ask me for my advice, in inverted commas, about going into politics. And I have to say, well, for me, it pretty much happened by chance, quite a lot of it, or at least it wasn't planned in any way. So as you mentioned, I was an academic for really quite a long time. While I was doing that, I was always quite involved with the Labour Party. So I've been an officer of the Labour Party in different roles. I've been a candidate. To be a councillor in local government and to be a parliamentary candidate as well, but never really thinking it was going to be my kind of full-time career. And then a few years ago, a friend rang me and said, well, we need to find somebody to go on the European list for the South East. Would you like to do it? And at that time, I said initially no, because I was pregnant. And I thought, I can't possibly think about doing that then. And also I thought, well, I don't know a huge amount about the machinations within the European Parliament, etc. But my partner said, look, you're always complaining about, European politics on TV, how little coverage of it there was in the UK. Of course, this was before the referendum. Why don't you do something about it? Why don't you stop complaining and do something about it? So obviously I did put myself forward, then became a member of the European Parliament. And I was anticipating I'd go back into academia after that. I was very, very grateful. My previous institution that I was working for said that they'd be willing for me to go back as a senior lecturer. So I was expecting I would do as we left the European Union. But then the constituency where I live, obviously Oxford East, it quite unexpectedly really became vacant because the sitting MP, Andrew Smith, who'd been the MP for 30 years, he said that he wanted to stand down. So I thought, well, I would absolutely love to do this. I'd love to, represent the place where I live.
But it's true, isn't it, though, that British politics has been utterly toxic the last few years. Don't you think?
I think it has been. I suppose in the past, I always reflected on the high esteem with which Britain was regarded. And of course, you'll be very well aware of this, Rob, as well, with your work in the World Service. And I did quite a lot of work in the Western Balkans, for example, other places where there was a very divisive politics, where there was, in inverted commas, fake news and, social media that was really divisive, all this kind of thing. And I guess I kind of always thought we wouldn't see that kind of thing in the UK, but we have seen some aspects of it, I think, disturbingly. I still have a lot of faith. I think there's still a huge amount of commitment in the population to particularly local institutions and to things like the National Health Service and that kind of thing. But yeah, certainly at national level, we've seen some who've privileged, I think, division and maybe short-term kind of interest above the national interest. I think that has been a problem from my point of view.
Right. Well, we may have time to come back to more of that at the end about the sort of the general direction and nature and tenor of British politics. But I guess I should zoom on that. The question in the title of Rachel Sylvester's piece, that Anneliese Dodds is now one of the most important people in British politics. Here's why. I think what she meant was that it's sort of up to you to restore the Labour Party's credibility on economic matters, because all the research from the last election suggested that the big problems Labour had was that it was divided over, its position over Brexit was confusing for some people. Jeremy Corbyn was clearly toxic for a large section of the population, and that I think something like fewer than 1 in 5 trusted Labour on the economy, and that's about right. That is why it's right to say that about you, isn't it? You've got a big job on your hands.
Well, I suppose there's the job related to the Labour Party, but I would say that there's, of course, a much bigger job, which is just generally around the UK economy and the role of us an opposition in these circumstances where, clearly we're going through the biggest recession that we've seen in 300 years. And I think, some of the normal, party political issues that might have fed in and kind of considerations of partisan advantage, certainly I feel they're quite far away. I know that's the same for Keir as well. Keir Starmer, the leader of the Labour Party, that we're very much thinking through, well, how can we improve the situation, trying to set out solutions really, and not have the kind of usual party political knockabout. So I think these are different circumstances, but certainly, I obviously saw what happened over the last few years. We know from polling evidence, for example, that a number of Labour's policies at the time of the last election were actually relatively popular with the public. But the problem was, as soon as you said they were Labour policies, people said they didn't want them anymore. So that issue about credibility and trust and people believing that we could deliver is really, really important. And it is something that we've got to get right. There's no question about that.
We'll zoom on to COVID, don't worry. It's impossible to have a conversation these days that isn't dominated by that. But just staying with the Labour Party for a little bit longer. Of course, an internal report came out today saying that essentially Labour had a mountain to climb to get back into power. What do you think is the hardest part of that ascent? Is it winning back credibility on economics? Is it getting working class people to vote Labour again? What would you say it is? Or maybe you don't think it's going to be that big a climb and that big a mountain to climb.
Well, it will be a big mountain to climb. I don't think there's any, to mix metaphors, I don't think there's any silver bullet that's going to get us there. I think it's a combination of different imperatives, both, building up that trust with people, having very open conversations with people. So I've been doing a lot of those. Obviously within my constituency, normally try and get out on the doorstep every Sunday morning. Clearly it's right to do so now, but doing as much of that online as possible and across the country, hearing directly from people about where they felt Labour wasn't in the right place, particularly people who decided not to vote for us. And I think some of it also is, building up that presence and that trust in areas where we might have had Labour MPs before, but unfortunately we've lost them. We're going to have council elections next year, elections in Scotland next year as well. Virtually the whole of the UK is going to be going to the polls next year because of the elections that are backed up from this spring that are pushed into next year. So clearly, that's going to be a big test for us, and I think that's one that we're going to have to rise to if we're going to be in a good position, hopefully, for the subsequent general election.
Right. Well, again, hopefully we'll get a bit of time to get on to more of that. We have to move on to COVID, of course. Labour has, of course, been immensely critical of the government. I know it's that constructive criticism, but you perfectly understandably, many would say, have pointed out that the government was too slow to lock down, was too slow on testing, too slow on PPE, on protective equipment for people working on the front line, and too slow with the lockdown. But I mean, what exactly would you have done differently? And the reason I ask, and the one has to be a bit skeptical here, I'm not going to do a sort of Andrew Neil on Friday night, is that I went back through every single official Labour statement in March, before, of course, Keir Starmer was leader, and at no point did Labour call for a lockdown to have come earlier.
Yeah, I mean, I remember actually being involved in some of those debates, and we did consistently say that we need to follow the science on this. I think what has become clear is that where there's more transparency about science, people can judge for themselves whether one particular interpretation is being taken or another. And I think that perhaps was some of what occurred around the lockdown decisions. I mean, certainly from the economic side, which obviously I've been kind of more engaged in, we were calling for some kind of a short hours working system, learning from other countries, for really quite a long time before it got put into place. Again, we've called currently for a proper budget, given the scale of unemployment that very sadly is going to be even greater unless we take a number of actions now. And I think, specifically around the health response, and of course, this is now feeding into the economic set of circumstances we're facing. We have set forward, a number of different areas where particularly the test, track and isolate system can be improved, learning from how other countries have got this right. And I think one very big frustration for me, particularly where I'm sat right now in a city like Oxford, where I know we've got the scientists who are developing the vaccine and the treatments that the whole world is going to benefit from. That we've had all of that, we've had our magnificent NHS, and yet we haven't necessarily had the decisions backing that up at national level.
Sure. I mean, I don't want to dwell on what's already happened excessively, but do you think you could put hand on heart and say things would have been much different at the start of this crisis if Labour had been in power and not the Conservatives? Or you just think it's one of these nightmares that was bound to floor any government?
Well, I mean, hindsight is a wonderful thing. Of course it is. And I don't think, to be honest with you, right now, when we're still in the middle of this crisis, to me, the critical thing isn't to kind of point backwards and say, we told you so, and you should have done this and you should have done that. It's to say, well, look, where we know there still are problems, like, particularly test, track and isolate, where we're still far behind other countries. Here's what we need to sort out now to get us to a better place. I think that for me, that's really what people are looking to politicians to do, not to kind of snidely say, oh, you got this wrong and you got that wrong, etc. It's to actually try and get it fixed. And we certainly need to get it fixed.
On the you said that there should be a summer budget. I mean, what would you put in it if there was one?
Yeah, I mean, it looks like we'll have some kind of a budget statement, but not necessarily a full budget. Again, we've been trying to look at what other countries are doing around the unemployment challenge in particular. And in many cases, they've already taken action to stop people becoming unemployed. So, for example, encouraging people to stay in education for longer, varying their economic packages so that they don't have any cliff edges pushing people into unemployment. Also building up their support for those who become unemployed, and announcing their stimulus packages so that businesses will have confidence that they can keep people on, now, and they won't have to lay them off, in a few months' time. We haven't really done any of those things yet in the UK. So that's why we think we need a proper budget, one that's focused on particularly preventing unemployment and getting people back into work afterwards. That's what seems to be working in other countries, but we're not doing it yet here.
So, talking of budgets, Anneliese, so you'll know, goodness, you'll know this so much better than I do, but that in 2010, after the financial crash, that the Conservative government inherited a budget deficit of about 150 billion pounds from Labour, from the situation. The OBR is now saying the official prediction is that the UK will borrow more than 300 billion pounds this year. I mean, I guess the obvious question is how is that ever going to be paid back?
Yeah, I mean, it is a very important question. I mean, clearly we are in different circumstances currently because we're in a very, very low interest rate environment. And so you see across the world, countries taking that into account, very often accepting that if it's necessary to take action now to particularly ensure that demand is pushed up as much as possible, that may be necessary, even although in the short term it could increase the size of the debt. But ultimately, we may not be in those low interest rate circumstances forever. We don't know what might happen, particularly in emerging markets, into the future. And therefore, if it is necessary to, in particular, try and make sure that we bring that deficit down, then again, we need to learn from what's worked elsewhere. We shouldn't see the kinds of responses that we've seen over the last 10 years, where we've had, big cuts in spending, long squeeze on living standards. That's actually depressed the tax take that has then come in to the exchequer overall. We should learn from that. And when we need to be paying for that, really we should be saying, those with the very broadest shoulders, very often right now, they're actually wanting to make more of a contribution when it's a fair one. And that's the way to deal with this, rather than to be, depressing demand and constraining the incomes of those low and middle income earners.
Although, I mean, I don't think we've got time to have a detailed discussion of economics, but I guess many would say that you already have kind of, the richest 1% paying 28% of income tax. There just simply aren't enough rich people in the country to fork out 300 billion. And actually, I would raise this issue about whether when you have something like this, if a country is going to basically be a lot poorer, doesn't the state get smaller and services poorer? I mean, isn't that what happens if there's a big recession? I mean, shouldn't politicians level with the British people that there's going to be some incredibly difficult choices?
Oh, there absolutely will be very difficult choices. And I would say, actually, even before we get into this, that exactly what that money is being spent on is pretty important as well, and making sure that it's directed to the right places, that we don't have failed schemes that were, very expensive, that don't help tackle this disease, etc. That's really pretty important in addition. But as I said before, we should be learning from the experience of previous crises and what other countries are doing. When I look at the UK economy, one of the things that worries me the most is what's happened to demand. Now, there are many people who say, well, there's just suppressed demand. It's just going to, bounce back as soon as different restaurants, etc., are open. Well, actually, if people are nervous about going into those facilities, they are not going to be going in to spend their money. If they're worried about the future of their job, they're not going to be again, going in to spend. That means there won't be the take on VAT, everything else. So the shape of that economic and the size of that economic pie, isn't something that stays static over time. Obviously, it really can be very strongly influenced by public policy, as we've seen over the last few years. So I think to kind of, absolve politicians from any responsibility for that demand issue it wouldn't be right. But then equally, as I said, we've got to be upfront about how that reckoning would then occur. And I would just say, I'm sorry, I can't help myself on the 1% point. You're absolutely right when it comes to income tax. But of course, that highlights the fact that we've got enormous disparities in wealth in this country that have actually been lengthening over recent years. So again, I think a fairer settlement is probably what many people would want to be seeing now.
Right, I have been hogging your time, Anneliese, and of course there have been lots of questions, and I'm outside, as you can see, as everyone can see, and there's by a river, so there's a fisherman who's looking at me. He's giving me some very odd looks, so I'll have to explain it later. Right, so I am going to start opening up with start introducing questions from our audience, and I'll start with one from East Oxford, appropriately enough, Uton Daly, and I wanted to use this question because it gets to the big issue of whether the pandemic is one of those change moments in national and international history. So Uton asks, during the pandemic, we've all come to realize on many different facets that what was once deemed normal is in fact not normal. So what can you do to ensure that as we return from lockdown, we do not just return to the same values, the same ways of doing things, nature of education, learning, 24/7 working life, which affects families and communities, status of those at the bottom of the chain that suddenly we see as key essential workers, etc., etc. So it's a sort of question about, what are you going to do to stop things going back from normal?
I mean, it's an enormous question, really, and I think it's one that we could all talk about for many evenings, really, because, Uton's absolutely right. This situation really has changed people's conceptions about what's important. I mean, I guess if I had to kind of parse out three areas, it would be around community, around work, and around the environment, where I think, first of all, the kinds of, and it's particularly in evidence in East Oxford, Rose Hill, where I'm speaking to you, lots and lots of different parts of Oxford, where the way people have come together to protect each other and help each other out has been just absolutely astonishing. It's really been very, very moving to see how that's happened, and, people from all backgrounds working together. I think it's really important that we continue that actually somehow. Now, that will mean that we try and make sure some of those structures are continued, that we make sure that actually local authorities also have the resources to try and keep those kind of mechanisms there. And, I think that's particularly important, given that lots of people who are medically vulnerable, very sadly, could end up, still having to stay in a kind of semi-shielding situation for really quite a long time. So that's very, very important, I think.
But do you think this is one of those change moments, and that a year from now things will look very different? People won't be working in offices so much, that people will be different in the way that they behave to each other, there will still be social distancing. I mean, is it one of those change moments, do you think?
I think most definitely, yeah. I mean, I think on those two other issues around work and the environment.
Sorry, I interrupted you.
No, not at all. I always think in threes. There you go, core politician thing. There you are. But yeah, I think there is a major change that's occurred because of partly what Uton said, that it, for example, around work, we're suddenly realising work is really, really important, and how a lot of the time it's appallingly poorly paid and with very, very bad terms and conditions. So, I mean, there was some suggestion, for example, there might be a public sector pay freeze after this. I can't imagine the British public swallowing that, actually. I just don't think people would accept that for some of our worst paid workers, whether they're in the NHS or social care. We've seen how important they are. So I think it will be very difficult for any government to avoid the need for, labour market reform, really engaging with those issues about pay. But then, as I said, I think also, this is a time when environmental issues are coming to the fore in a way that I can't remember for many years. I mean, they need to, because of the climate crisis, obviously, which is on us right now.
Right.
But I think, to see many businesses, for example, saying they want there to be a green recovery, they don't want public support being given to businesses if they don't comply with environmental conditions, etc. To have that coming from a business voice as well as from NGOs, from the public and others, that is to me a very, very big change. And as I said, it's something that needs to happen anyway, very, very urgently. But I am quite encouraged by some of what's being put forward right now in that regard.
A silver lining in this almighty cloud of a pandemic. Goodness gracious. Right, I'm going to move on to another. It's a specific question about a specific sector, and you'll bear with me while I go through the papers. This one is from Deborah Deborah Annett. She's Chief Executive, ISM, Incorporated Society of Musicians. Will the Labour Party pressure the government to deliver a long-term financial support package for the creative industries in line with the recent €50 billion package put in place by the German government?
Yeah, I mean, that it's a really critical issue that Deborah raises. And I think looking at the current lockdown arrangements and the extent to which, even if they are altered, whether we'll see that resumption of demand in the short term, I think sadly the creative industries, I mean, they've been one of the industries that has been definitely the hardest hit. But that hit may last a very, very long time, unfortunately. So I have been working closely with Jo Stevens, who's our Shadow Secretary of State for Department of Culture, Media and Sport, working very closely with her about what we could be encouraging government to do to deliver that kind of support that's necessary. So we do think there needs to be a sectoral approach to this. But we've also said that, with some of those big economic support packages like the furlough scheme, the self-employed scheme, really we think they should be tied more to the lifting of lockdown and how that impacts on different sectors. Because, very, very sadly, even if we see theatres, for example, being able to reopen, I really hope they will be soon, as soon as it's safe for that to happen, but they may well be at significantly reduced capacity. Well, we know that very often you need to have about 80% seats in a theatre filled in order for them to be economic. So, and they're institutions that are viable into the future. Once we've got through this crisis, once that confidence is back, then we've dealt with the health problems. People will still want to go to these kinds of venues. They're really important for local communities. So we do think that there should be a more nuanced look at this rather than cutting off support for every sector at the same time. Let's see a more subtle approach being developed.
Right, I've got another one again, which is related to the arts, and it's from Paul Max Edlin in Deal in Kent. He says the creative industries generate over £1 billion for our national economy, almost as much as the financial industries. Why, when we know the unique benefits of arts education, so proudly championed and delivered in independent schools, is it being increasingly jeopardized and denied in the state sector, which serves 93% of our children? What creditable reason is there for a government to continue to take such a stance?
Well, I think that Paul is absolutely right about the importance of arts education. It really is critical that children have the chance to explore their creative side and, everything else that kind of an education can bring. Certainly, I'm really delighted that my son, when he finally goes back to a little bit of school, which is going to start from next week, that he does get some of that input. I think it's very, very important. And I would say not just in relation to the arts, but actually many other sectors. I think this crisis has exposed that there are many inequalities, unfortunately. I know that schools like Magdalen College School, they try and make sure that they work with other schools in Oxford, and that's a great thing that they do that. But we do see that there is that big disparity there, whether it's around arts in terms of, kind of physical art, as it were, but then also performing arts. Music, of course, there's a big difference, and I know MCS is supporting a number of initiatives in that regard. But also it applies, many people would say, to areas like sport as well, other forms of extracurricular activity where there's a big, big gap. So yeah, it's definitely something that I'm aware of and concerned about.
Okay, a couple of quick fire questions on education then. The government says today, I think it was today, I've been out, I've absolutely confessed, I've been out fishing. Well, it's Friday, right? But the government said it wants, Gavin Williamson has said, the Education Secretary, all children back in school in September. That's something that you think will happen, want to see happen?
Well, I certainly want to see it happen, if at all possible. But I think there are many conditions that need to be there before it can happen. I'm somebody who's said all along, I really want children to be back in school as soon as it's safe to do so. I think what we've ended up having is really quite a divisive discussion about this issue in the UK, kind of teaching unions being pitted against parents, and this really isn't the way to sort out these matters. We need to properly deal with them, work out where the pinch points are. When we don't have enough space in our schools, then we need to be looking at other venues. There's leisure centres, theatres I was just talking about. There are other spaces that can be used. We should be thinking about where we can, at porta cabins, etc., where that's necessary. We've got to be creative about this.
So on that, sorry to interrupt. So on that issue, because I think I think the Prime Minister was asked this, that essentially if you want all the kids to go back to school in September, you either need to relax the 1 metre, the 2 meters, you need to go from 2 meters to 1 meter on the social distancing, or just have bigger schools. I mean, are you saying that you and Labour would prefer the second one, bigger schools?
Well, if the scientific evidence changes and suggests that 1 meter distance is all that's required to prevent against infection, then that wouldn't be necessary. But actually, there are many schools which currently aren't able to take children back because they don't have that space there under current rules. And, I really think we need to be dealing with this because, as I said, there are enormous gaps. I mean, there were gaps and inequalities beforehand. They've been absolutely multiplied through this crisis. And we know that something like 20% of children have had on average less than an hour of any kind of educational input a day throughout this crisis. This is something that will store up many problems for us in the future unless we properly get a grip on it.
Right. I mean, just seeing as we're on schools, and I hope I'm not talking out of class here or being too controversial, but the last Labour manifesto was obviously very hostile to the idea of independent schools. Will that change now that Mr. Corbyn has gone?
I mean, throughout that period, I had a lot of really good conversations with the independent sector in Oxford and elsewhere. And I think, one thing's very clear to me. I think there are schools in the independent sector who really do fulfill that charitable mandate. They do make sure that they have that interaction with other schools, that they share their facilities, that they are engaged in community work and so forth. But that's not always the case, right, across the whole sector. We know that's not always the case. Let's be honest about it. I think, the previous Labour policy was trying to say, there needs to be a more uniform contribution. Now, it wouldn't be sensible for me to be designing Labour Party policy for the next manifesto at all. We've got a process to do that. But I am still concerned about that fact that you've got some schools, like, and I'm not just saying this because of the current context, but MCS, for example, does, I know, try and do that community outreach, but there are others who don't. So there is an imbalance there, and I think we shouldn't really shy away from it.
Right, but we could obviously have an entire evening talking about that kind of thing. So I'll zoom on to some of the others. This is one. It's a kind of question that requires a long answer, but if you could try and keep it short. So it's from Alexis Thompson in the Cotswolds. In the face of the escalating climate crisis, species extinction, and irreversible damage to our planet, how would Labour make the necessary and tough changes a reality rather than rhetoric? I told you it was an easy kind of one with a quick answer.
Okay, yeah. Well, I mean, it's ultimately, in the long term, the most important question, because we know that the climate crisis is upon us already, as well as the other aspects of environmental damage that Alexis mentioned. I mean, I think just to focus on one area, for me, the critical thing is actually to be taking action now. And I know that sounds a bit trite and a bit obvious, but we've had so much discussion about what the targets are for getting to net zero. And yet we're still doing things right now that are compromising our ability to get there. So we're still, for example, very, very often, just as a default, going to build roads rather than focusing on sustainable forms of transport. It'll be interesting to see what happens in July around whether there's a lot of road investment or whether it's focused on sustainable transport. We want it to be focused on the latter. We're still subsidising fossil fuel extraction through the tax system. How can we still be doing these things? We're still building homes which aren't energy efficient. We have to act like we believe in what Parliament agreed, not so many months ago, which is that we actually are in a climate emergency. And if there's an emergency, you do something about it. You don't wait until we're, 20, 30, 40 years down the road. So it's about taking action now.
Right, another big topic, Brexit. We couldn't possibly have a chat without talking about Brexit. So Labour is not calling for an extension to the transition, but is rather holding the government to its promise to get a deal. But I mean, if the government doesn't get a deal, I'm presuming Labour will call for an extension.
Well, first of all, apologies for the dog barking in the background. It's not my dog. I don't have a dog. I mean, you're right. I mean, we think that ultimately, obviously, the UK government promised that it would get that deal. You know, Labour wanted a different approach to this, obviously, but sadly, we didn't win the general election. We accept that. So we are really trying to push government around that. I mean, if they don't get any kind of a deal, then, you know, ultimately we need to make sure we get to the best solution, particularly in circumstances where huge numbers of businesses will have been put under enormous pressure because of the current crisis. And, you know, ultimately ending up at the end of the year with extra trade barriers slapped onto British companies would really not be sensible. Now, how exactly that would be organised by the EU, you know, when they've said that they wouldn't accept an extension, you know, there may well be some kind of a fudge that could be found, certainly some suggestions that that's what would be arrived at. But, you know, for me, the critical thing is, why would we want to apply additional barriers, as I said before, to companies that will have probably, many of them, just struggled through the summer, and then this could be the kind of final straw that breaks the camel's back.
Which brings me to a question from a Rob Watson from the BBC World Service, lives in Oxford. Sorry, I thought I'd write down a question of my own. You were a Remainer. The government's own forecast suggests there is no form of Brexit that won't harm the economy. Many would also say that Brexit is looking nothing like what was promised by the Leave campaign. I mean, if it does turn out badly, should Labour at least consider being a party of rejoining the European Union?
Well, I mean, I think there are a number of different potentials in that, to be honest. I mean, clearly.
But I mean, if you know, look, the government's own forecasts suggest there's no form of Brexit that won't harm the economy. I mean, if that comes on top of the pandemic, I mean, might people not have a different view of leaving the EU? Oh, you've got a visitor.
I'm sorry, this isn't planned.
Don't worry.
Anyway, yeah, I mean, that there could be a different valuation, but, you know, ultimately, I do accept that Labour lost that last general election, and we were putting forward a different approach to this question. But very unfortunately, we lost those arguments. And, you know, nobody feels more regret about that than I do. And as you say, I was someone who campaigned for us to remain in the EU. I mean, to me, the really critical questions right now are ones about kind of the detail of what that relationship is going to be. And I think that's something that Labour can influence right now, trying to make sure that we don't have a really damaging no deal or lack of a deal.
Right. Now, we could talk about Brexit all night, couldn't we? But I must move on to other questions. Here's one from Graham Waller from Windsor. And he asks, is the tearing down of statues going to help the BLM movement, or has the movement been hijacked by the extreme left?
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting question. And actually, in Oxford, obviously, there's been a huge amount of debate around particularly the statue of Cecil Rhodes at Oriel College. You know, it's something where there's been a lot of discussion. As so often in politics, that then kind of got boiled down to, you know, suggesting this issue had only just arisen. It hadn't. It had been, you know, an issue of contention for a very, very long time. You know, I think in many cases we do have these symbols which ultimately are viewed as very oppressive by very many people. I think it's important to recognise that hurt. But, you know, to me, the most important thing is that as we deal with those symbols of oppression, we actually do something about all of the experiences of racism that people still have in our communities. And, you know, we've had so many reviews around this. We've had so many recommendations, but very, very few of them being implemented. To me, that's really what we need to do to make sure that we're showing that Black Lives Matter and that people are listened to and that we are taking action. That, to me, is really going to be the most important thing over the months and years to come.
more important than a sort of mass movement of statues to from plinths to museums?
Well, I think that ultimately, clearly this has been a time when, very many people have been deeply, deeply hurt by what happened, initially in the US, but because it had resonance with many people's experience in the UK of structural racism, it did lead to many, many people feeling very, very hurt about this. And, instead of having from our nation's leaders and others that focused on saying, well, how can we understand this? How can we do something about this, eradicate that racism? Instead, there were some who were really keen to use it as a way of stoking up division. I think that was very, very unhelpful indeed, particularly at a time of national crisis. At these kinds of times, we've got to try and bring people together, try and understand each other more. We should always try and do that anyway, but I think particularly at this time, it's very, very important.
Right. Now, I'm going to now, here's a great question. So this is a sort of question that's about to be bringing us towards the end of our discussion. It's a great question. It's from Hugo Macklin in Cambridge. Just shows you how incredibly tolerant and broad-minded we are here at the Oxford Arts Festival, that we include questions from Cambridge. And this is a very philosophical question about politics. So I'll read it out. I'll read it out to you, Anneliese. It's: current events seem to confirm that politics and policy making in democratic states have become damagingly short-termist, with decisions often taken on the basis of 1 to 5 year time horizons, even at the direct expense of 10 to 50-year outcomes. The political reasons for this are, in many cases, fairly evident, but remain difficult to solve without endangering popular democratic principles as they are currently understood. How do you and the new Labour leadership propose to redress this damaging trend and put responsible transgenerational government back at the heart of contemporary politics? There you go. Good question from Hugo in Cambridge.
It's a very good question. I suppose I might slightly challenge a little bit of the premise, because I do think that there are democratic governments which have shown that they are able to command public support, doing so in a democratic manner, and ultimately deal with this crisis very, very sensibly. I would say that there are a number of countries in the EU that have managed to do that actually independently. They have managed to deal with this crisis, and they've had, lower health impacts than we have in the UK. Looks like they may have had less of an economic impact as well. And actually, in some more authoritarian systems, the lack of transparency around, for example, the beginnings of this disease, the spread of this disease, etc., has been incredibly damaging. So I suppose I would say that I don't think long-termism is something that more authoritarian systems find easy either. So I'd start off with that, but then I do think there are many things that can be done around this. I mean, obviously, I kind of focus a lot of the time on the economic side, and we really don't look at long-term economic questions closely enough. There are many ways that you can do that. You can incorporate that much more forcefully into budgeting. You can actually have a 5, 10, 15, 20, 30-year time horizon and assess spending against that time horizon. And of course, incorporating into that the long-term impacts of the climate crisis, which, as we've known since Lord Stern's report, are very substantial as well. So you can do these things, through some technical changes, change the Treasury's Green Book, you change the methods of budgeting. But then I think also just demonstrating that long-term approach trying to do so in everything that you do can be very, very helpful. I mean, there's symbolic ways of doing it as well. I think, is it in New Zealand, where there's actually a minister for future generations? I think there might be one in Wales as well. There are the ways that you can do this symbolically, but there's technical things you can do and policy-based things as well.
And, you politicians do have to face getting re-elected every 5 years. So there's that there has to be a certain immediacy to it. Now, talking of getting elected and getting people to vote for you, these questions are now coming a bit sort of randomly, Anneliese, but that's fine. This is from Ben Andre, who asks, clearly Labour, well, first of all, he states, clearly Labour has done a good job at getting the youth vote on side. What are your views on the best way to get the older voter back to your party? It's a good question.
It is a good question. I mean, I would say, first of all, Ben, I wouldn't take any young person's support for granted, for sure. So, you know, we need to make sure that we're reflecting their concerns as well. But I would say, you know, particularly at this time, it's very, very important that the particular challenges that many older people might be facing are borne in mind. I mean, clearly, very, very sadly, borne the brunt of the health impacts of this crisis, but actually economically as well. Think about the situation of someone who's 55, 60, who works in catering or hospitality or tourism for all their working life. Could be that they're becoming unemployed at this time for the very, very first time in their life for a long period. So certainly we're looking into, well, what tailored support could we be arguing for groups of older people? I think also focusing on, you know, that desire which actually cuts across generations, but above all for security, you know, that's so palpable now. I think Labour needs to make it clear that we are the party that will be focused on trying to ensure that for everybody, you know, across all age groups, really.
Right, I'm gonna conclude with a few rapid fire ones, and some, you know, reflecting the fact that it's sort of Friday evening and we should have a bit of a, you know, a bit of light and shade. So tell me what you think is what's been the worst thing for you about the lockdown and the best thing.
Goodness,
That's
I mean,
isn't it?
Yeah, I don't know if this is probably much more shade than light. I mean, I think the kinds of circumstances that so many of my constituents have ended up in, that I've heard about, have been, you know, really heartbreaking. You know, I mean, somebody not so far away from where I'm speaking to you from, you know, they saw this coming. They saw all of their work drying up. They couldn't see any way out, and you know, it was just an overwhelming thing for them. And you know, I think we will sadly probably the rate of gone up because of this, because it's just been such an overwhelmingly difficult time for so many people, so destructive. So very, very, very difficult. But I suppose in terms of the light, I mean, it really has been that community effort. It's been absolutely incredible. You know, the way that people have looked out for each other, that they've connected to each other. You know, I've had people saying to me that they'd barely even spoken to some of their neighbours before. Now they know everybody in their street. You know, they're kind of phone call or texting each other when they find out it's somebody's birthday, all this kind of thing. I mean, that has been wonderful. And somehow it's got to keep that community spirit alive.
And one last thought. I mean, I was wondering when people looking out at the world and they feel very unsettled. I mean, who wouldn't be unsettled by the pandemic? I think a lot of people have also found Brexit, whether they're either for it or against it, the whole thing is profoundly unsettling. People have found people like President Trump, you know, profoundly unsettling. The United States, normally the UK's closest ally. I was wondering whether you think people might look back on this sort of moment as the sort of the high tide mark of populism and populists, or whether things may in fact get worse, as it were.
Yeah, I mean, that's a really big and important question, because you're right, it could go in two directions. It could lead to a rejection of populism, and actually, you know, we've seen in many cases it's been the more populist leaders who've been doing much, much worse in terms of dealing with this crisis. But equally, we could see a stoking up of some of those divisions that we've just been talking about, and people becoming more divided. I mean, I have to say, I think that when we look at what some of the collective institutions have been able to do, you know, particularly we look at our NHS. I mean, I know it's a cliche, but you think about what has been achieved by the National Health Service. It really is absolutely remarkable. At the start of this crisis, we were all anticipating it could be overwhelmed. It's kept going. You know, people have more of an awareness of that institution and how important it is than ever. And I am an optimist a lot of the time. And I think that faith and trust in what we can do when we work together, you know, we all pay for the NHS, you know, so many people work in it and support it. It works because it's supported by our society. And my goodness, isn't it amazing what it's achieved? So hopefully we can kind of build on that spirit into the future. And as a result of that, reject more divisive measures, I would hope.
Right, I could carry on asking questions for forever and ever. I was gonna give in some really cheeky ones, like if you had to describe Boris Johnson in 2 paragraphs to someone who hadn't switched on the radio or had come from another planet, what would you say? But maybe that's very, very unfair. We'll do it another time, or we'll do it off air or something. But Anneliese, thank you so much for your time, and thank you so much for talking to us. We go back to the headline in the argument. Potentially one of the most important politicians in British politics in the years ahead. Heavy responsibility. And with that responsibility on your shoulders, go and have a lovely Friday evening, and a lovely weekend and a lovely Friday evening to everybody else. And thanks to the Oxford Arts Festival. Thanks for asking me to do this. Thanks for not minding that I was sitting by the river and couldn't get the sound on. And I hope everybody's enjoyed it and found it interesting.
Great. Thanks ever so much. It's been such a pleasure. And I hope the rest of the festival goes really, really well. Thanks a lot.